All right, so let's talk about writing task 1 academic, simple bar graphs. So I just want to start off by saying that a lot of people don't spend enough time preparing for writing task 1 because it's worth less than writing task 2. So writing task 1 is 1/3 of your writing score, writing task 2 is 2/3. You have 20 minutes for writing task 1, you need 40 minutes for writing task 2. But that being said, because of the way they average the grades, if you don't get the score you want, let's say you're aiming for band 7 and you don't get band 7 on both, you're not going to get band 7. So in essence, both are equally important. You have to get band 7 on both. Okay. So this writing task is not easy. You're being tested on your ability to accurately describe data and patterns in data, and you only have 20 minutes to write a 150 to 200 word description. That being said, it's a very useful, very important writing task because this is the kind of information you provide to support all of your ideas in any kind of academic text, in any kind of scientific report, business report. So this is a very common writing task in college, in university, even in high school. And that's why this is the first writing task. So let's look at so this is a typical example of a bar graph. It'll say something like the chart shows the total number of minutes in billions of telephone calls in the UK, divided into 3 categories from 1995 to 2002. So it's a completely descriptive writing task. There's no opinions. There's no deeper analysis. You don't bring in any background information. It's just a picture, and then you need to describe it in words. You need to find the main patterns that are in the graph and describe them. So the principles of writing an effective IELTS Task 1 description, and we'll go through the rubric. The rubric is this grid here, which they use for marking your work. So task achievement refers to the overall quality of your response, whether you cover all the information in the graph, and whether you provide a general overview. So it tells you that you need to see here it's where it says under task achievement band 7, the second point presents a clear overview of main trends, differences, or stages. So you have to start with a clear overview of main differences, main trends. So this is equivalent to the context and thesis statement in an essay. Basically, the structure of your first paragraph is the same in both writing task 1 and writing task 2. In writing task 2 in the essay, you start off by paraphrasing the context in the prompt. You do exactly the same thing in writing task 1. In writing task 2, the essay, your next sentence is your opinion. It's your position on the topic, your thesis statement. There's no thesis in writing task 1 because it's not an argument. All you're doing is giving a general overview of the trends in the graph that you're going to describe in detail in the body paragraphs. On some websites, I see this advice that it's okay to put the general overview either at the beginning or at the end, but I strongly suggest that you not do that. Writing proceeds from general to specific, so in my mind, it makes no sense to put a general overview at the end of your graph. By all means, you can, in one sentence, summarize the author's point in providing this data at the end, but it's not necessary. There's no conclusion necessary in this task. Okay, in terms of the volume of writing, you have to summarize the key features of the graph in 1 to 3 body paragraphs, and you cannot neglect any of the information. If you leave out any of the information, you're not getting band 7. You don't want to interpret any of the information. Even if you have expert background knowledge on the topic, do not talk about it. You have to limit yourself to what's visible in the graph. Point 4, you have to support your descriptions of the main patterns with data. This is a common mistake I see, is that people just describe the data in very general terms, but they don't support their descriptions with the actual numbers. You have to do that. The other thing is you have to point out patterns. The instructions always say, make comparisons where relevant. So they don't want you to just summarize the numbers from left to right in a graph. Nobody wants to read that. That's why the person created the graph in the first place. So how to find these patterns is you have to simply ask yourself, why did the author or designer create the graph? What point were they trying to make? And we'll take a look at that throughout the day in a few examples. You have to be very careful about accuracy. In the Band 6 descriptor, it says here at the bottom, details may be irrelevant, inappropriate, or inaccurate. So if the examiner notices that any of your numbers are inaccurate, you're getting a 6 or lower, depending on the number of mistakes. Sometimes I hear people say, oh, a friend of mine made some mistakes in the graph, which she only noticed later, but she still got a band 7. Yes, sometimes because they are reviewing your writing so quickly, they do overlook things. They are assessing 25 of these per hour. Right, so they might overlook a minor issue, but I wouldn't bank on that. If they notice, you're not getting band 7. And again, it's not necessary to write a conclusion. Okay. Coherence and cohesion refers to the logical flow of ideas. Do your paragraphs make sense? And are you using transitions abundantly? So you should use transitions abundantly. Leave no doubt in your reader's mind how ideas are connected to each other. The order of information in your general overview matches the order information in the body paragraphs. This is called parallel structure. And we'll see examples of that several times today. I would strongly recommend following this structure. So as mentioned a few minutes ago, your intro starts by paraphrasing the prompt. This is an automatic step, and then write a general overview. Don't include specific data in the general overview. Save that specific data for the body paragraphs. In the real world as well, if you're giving a presentation and you start off with your introduction, avoid giving a lot of specific data. It just overwhelms the audience. It's confusing because they don't have the appropriate context in their minds to understand those details. You have to do it slowly. Okay, and you'll need to decide whether you need about 1 to 3 body paragraphs as appropriate. There are no specific rules or requirements for the number of paragraphs. A lot of the examples that IELTS shows, the whole thing is done in a single body paragraph. In other ones, it's 2. In other ones, it's 3. 2 body paragraphs seems to be the average. Okay, so you're describing in body paragraph 1, the main pattern in the data, which is also the first pattern you mentioned in the general overview. Okay, general terms, your topic sentence, again, is going to repeat that first main pattern, and then you're going to support it with evidence. So the actual numbers from the graph, and you can reiterate what the point of this data is. Because they don't want you to just list the information, they want you to talk about any patterns. Do the same thing for the second body paragraph, the second main pattern in the data. Again, the second point that you discussed in your general overview. So you can start off with the topic sentence to introduce that pattern, followed by evidence, and then you can end with stating the significance. Now, this is just a very general recommendation for the structure. We're going to see an example today where it's not as explicitly followed because it's not always appropriate. Sometimes you're just going to talk about the evidence. And sometimes the significance of your evidence is kind of going to be blended with the numbers themselves. Okay, and the last thing to watch out for, and this is very important, is referencing. Referencing means if you use something like a pronoun like he, is it clear what it refers back to? So if you first say people, which is plural, and then you switch to he, that confuses your reader. That's an automatic band 6 on Coherence Cohesion. Again, the first time you mention an idea in a paragraph, use the full name. Don't start paragraphs with pronouns like it, because the reader doesn't know what they refer back to. For a lexical resource, which is a fancy way of saying your vocabulary, you can only have occasional errors that have zero impact on communication. This is the rule of thumb. If your vocabulary error causes the examiner any kind of confusion, you get a band 6. If it's an error that doesn't cause confusion, and there aren't many of them, only a few, you'll get band 7. How do you catch these? Well, the biggest tip I can give you is to read your work out loud and let your ears tell you if anything sounds awkward. Your eyes are too fast for editing. For proofreading, you should very quietly read your work aloud. A lot of grammar is auditory. This is like the music or rhythm of the language. You have to let your ears catch these things that sound awkward. Again, I use the metaphor of playing a musical instrument. If you're playing an instrument, or if you're listening to someone playing an instrument and they hit the wrong note, even if you yourself don't play that instrument, you still know something doesn't sound right. So the simple rule is, if there's any doubt, leave it out. Replace that phrase or that word with something you're more confident about, even if it's a much simpler form. Clarity is the priority. Same goes for grammatical range and accuracy. For band 7, you can only have a few errors. Again, read your work out loud. If it sounds awkward in any way, use a simpler grammatical structure that you're totally confident with. And again, note that present simple and past simple are the most commonly used verb tenses. So there's often no need to use any complicated verb structures. You should use passive voice several times. This shows your grammatical range. And when you're proofreading, these are the ones that will really hurt your score, especially run-on sentences, fragments, and subject-verb agreement. All right, let's look at a model of a Band 9 response. Allah, can I hear you read this one?
The bar chart shows how many minutes in billions of telephone calls were made from 1995 to 2002 locally, nationally and internationally, and by mobile phone. Overall, it can be seen that number of local fixed line calls started and finished at the same point, while international calls and calls made by mobile increased significantly.
Okay,
The time
okay. Keep going.
The time spent on local telephone calls rose at first, but then decreased steadily, ending at the same level at which it started. Local calls from fixed lines started at just over 70 billion minutes in 1995 and climbed steadily to 90 billion by 1999, which was the highest number in the given period. However, from 1999, the number decreased to just over 70 billion by 2002. Yet, local fixed line calls were still the most common way of making phone calls. In contrast, the national and international fixed line calls, as well as mobile calls, followed a different pattern. National and international fixed line calls started at 37 billion minutes in 1995 and grew a year-on-year to 70 billion minutes by 2002. This trend was also seen in the figures for time spent on calls using mobile phone, all calls. In 1995, approximately 2 billion minutes of call were made on mobile, and this number grew to around 13 billion by 1995. Yet, From 1995, this number increased rapidly to 45 billion by 2002, by far the largest increase in the chart.
Okay, very nicely read. So this one is 239 words. The minimum is 150. You need to write closer to 200 words for a higher score. Okay, let's analyze this a little bit to look at the structure. I really like this model. It's got a super clear structure that if you can mimic this structure, that is ideal. Okay, let's take it from the top, Alon. Where did the author get the information for the first sentence? Where does this come from?
From the prompt.
Yes, from the prompt and also the information in the header.
Yes.
Okay. And where does the author describe the main point of the graph?
Here it can be seen that the number of local fixed lines started.
Yes.
Finished on it.
And the way you signal that this is your general overview, you can start by saying overall, you can start by saying generally speaking, you can start by saying in general. Okay, and that signals that that's your general overview. Does the author mention any specific data in the introduction?
Is this, I didn't hear you, sir.
Yeah. Does the author mention any specific data in the introduction?
Yes, from 1995 to 2002, this is a data.
Yes, so just the years. What about the percentages of the different phone call types?
Yes, he gave it like in the paragraph, like.
Yes, in the body paragraphs, right? But not
Yes.
here, not in the intro.
Yes.
Okay. It would be too repetitive if you put that kind of information in here too. It would also be confusing for the reader. The only thing they said, first pattern, local fixed line calls started and finished at the same point. So here, that's the red bar. Starts at around 70, ends at around 70, and then the other types of calls increase significantly.
Yes.
Okay. What's the purpose of the first sentence in the first body paragraph?
He's saying like the phone calls started at the same time and ended in the same level.
Yep. Notice how it mirrors the general overview, right? That's on purpose. That's an example of good writing. It's an example of very explicit writing. And if you remember what we talked about in terms of writing task 2, the essay, the format is basically the same, right? If you put a full thesis statement at the end of your first body paragraph, your first supporting reason is also going to be your first body paragraph. So the first part of your thesis is going to look a lot like your first topic sentence in the first body paragraph. Okay, and then what does the author do here? What's the purpose of this? Mm-hmm.
He's describing like he's like giving data about the paragraph.
Yeah, and that's an example of good writing. In any ideas that you present in an academic paper, in a scientific or a business paper, you give your idea and then you support that idea with numbers. That's how you prove that you're not just pulling this idea out of the air, that your arguments are backed up by some kind of logical information, by some kind of statistical information. Notice the author just talks about the starting point, the peak, and the end point. You don't need to mention all the intervening values if they occur in a smooth line. There's no value in talking about 96, 97, 2000, 2001. It's a very smooth pattern. Okay. And even though it decreased. The author wanted to point out that local fixed line calls were still the most common way of making phone calls in 2002, despite the decrease. Okay, and then we've got the same pattern in the next body paragraph. Again, general description, followed by supporting data. And what pattern does the author want to draw your attention to at the very end here?
He's saying like the largest number it was in 2002 in the whole paragraph.
Well, the blue ones, the mobile calls, they were the smallest number of calls in absolute terms, but in relative terms, they saw the biggest increase.
Yeah.
So that's a very important distinction. We'll look at that specific distinction. It's more obvious in other types of graphs, but if you can notice this distinction, the difference between absolute numbers and relative numbers, that's always worth pointing out.
Sir, like he's in the last paragraph, I think he's also gave a simple sentence on general, because also like same to the first one, we said like it start at the like from 70 till 70, from 1905 to 2002, and in the end he also said from 1999 till 2002. If you see the paragraph, it's also a general view, right?
Yep. Yes. So this would be like the significant statement, right? Despite all this, this is the pattern I want to talk about. They're still the most common way of making phone calls, and you're absolutely right. Yes, the significant statement, even though this was the lowest, it showed the largest increase. Yeah, it's good writing has parallels in its structure. It helps the reader to understand.